Hey everybody, welcome back to Part-Time Tabletopper. My name is Adam and I am here to do something a little bit different than I've done with my past videos. You know, historically I have done these in-depth step-by-step tutorials showing you how to make things for your tabletop games, and this is not going to be that same kind of video. My future videos, I'll probably go back to that, but I think when you see this build, you'll probably understand why I didn't go that route. So, I made the Moathouse from Greyhawk, the Temple of Elemental Evil, the Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil, a classic D&D setting and very recognizable location for any classic D&D players. So this is something that I made for somebody else, and I probably would never have attempted this without somebody asking me to do it in the first place. But because I was making it for somebody else, it meant I had a timeline. And with how much time went into making this project and the amount of time I had, adding a video into all of that and doing an in-depth tutorial was just way too much. So instead, what I'm going to do is show you guys the build, talk my way through how I started the process, how I built different parts of the building and the terrain board, and link back to progress photos and pictures and videos, things like that, because I do have a lot of those. But yeah, this is going to be kind of a post-build review, and if I can, I'll link other videos from other content creators or for myself that show techniques that I use myself to make this build in case you do want to know how to do something a little bit more specifically. But without further ado, let's go check out the Moathouse. So let's go ahead and actually start talking about the first step of any project like this, which is the planning process. This and anything of this caliber is something that you are going to have to do a ton of planning for, almost to the point like an architect would if you were building a house, just to make sure you know in advance, step by step, exactly all of the materials you're going to need, the cuts you're going to need to make, what the dimensions of everything are, and how it's all going to line up. So luckily for this, it's a very popular setting that's been done a couple times in a couple different modules, and so there were plenty of pieces of reference art and maps, more importantly, for me to use to make this, meaning I already had virtually a piece of grid paper designed out for me that showed the exact measurements of every room in the building, the perimeter of the building, the walls, and so that made it very easy for me to translate that to a checklist for myself and go, perfect. This is how big each wall needs to be. This is how wide it needs to be. This is how big every room is. Once I'd taken a couple days to really sit down, map all of that out, and give myself a checklist, the next step was to decide how I'm going to make it. So what materials am I going to use? How am I going to build the walls? How am I going to do the bricks, right? That probably took a little bit longer than it should have. But now that I've done it, I know what I would do and maybe wouldn't do in the future. But long story short is I did plan all of that out in advance as well. So planning, always going to be the first step when you're doing something like this. So the base itself, I'm sure you notice right off the bat that this looks like a swamp or a marsh board, which if you've seen any of my previous tutorials, you'll know that I made a swamp board. So these are literally just 4 2-foot by 2-foot swamp boards using the exact methods that I had in that tutorial. So I'm not going to kind of get into any of that now, but if you do want to know how to make that and you haven't seen the tutorial already, just check out my channel, look up the swamp board terrain, and it goes over the exact techniques and methods I used to do this. The one difference being this had a very specific map and layout that I needed to follow, where the other one, I just kind of made it up as I went. All right, so let's get into this actual building here. I'm gonna stand up and just kind of show you guys around and talk about how I put this together. So when I said I'm gonna build this, I was like, all right, the first thing that I'm going to do is start with the courtyard and the building pieces themselves, and then I'd kind of work my way out and do the walls last. Because the walls all needed to wrap perfectly around the building in the courtyard, naturally, these are going to be what I make first. This is the first piece of the build that I made. It's literally just a piece of MDF board that's been cut out into a 1 foot by 1 foot square. And then I took some Ready board, the dollar store foam board, cut that out into a 12 by 12 section, slapped it on there, drew my grid pattern and textured it. And this is what I used as the centerpiece for determining how I was going to build the rest of the building. So speaking of me taking all of this apart, let's take a step back and actually talk about the modularity of this build. As easy as this would have been to just kind of build it all as one solid piece, that's not very functional for shipping unless you want to pay an obscene amount of money, because even shipping this as is probably going to be a couple $100, not including, the boxes and the styrofoam and bubble wrap and all of that goes into it. So knowing it had to be modular, I built this into a couple different pieces. You've already seen the courtyard. I've already told you the walls are in 20 different segments. The building itself comes in multiple pieces. So not including the roof tiles, which do come off as individual pieces, and we'll get into that in a moment. The actual sections of the building are in 5 pieces as follows. We have 1, 2, 3, and then 4. I don't know if you could see that. We'll go 4, and then 5. I built each piece individually, started off with the base, and I'm going to show you one of them right here. Let me get all this out of the way. So, each one of these building pieces, with the exception of this top piece back here, is on a very thick piece of MDF board as the base. Once I had that cut out to the exact shape I knew it needed to be with a saw, I put some double corrugated cardboard as the actual board itself. Or I'm sorry, as the base, the structure, the foundation, the walls. So I used hot glue once I made all those cuts the way they needed to be, put those in here, and then lined everything up after they were all done with the 5 pieces, just to make sure everything lined up well. If it didn't, you can go back in there with like an X-Acto or an Alpha blade, cut it down and make sure everything lines up as flush as possible. You'll see as we get into this, even with me doing that, some of the cuts are not perfectly flush, but you know what? It's okay. You can hide a lot with painting and scatter terrain. So one of the other things that this buyer wanted was for you to be able to individually pull roof pieces off different rooms as the party was exploring the building. So I had to get a little creative to do that, and I'll show you maybe more later on, but all you need to know is that I used XPS foam, 1/2 inch thick, that I cut out using the measurements of the rooms that I had here to decide, okay, this room has exactly this dimensions, which means I need to cut that roof piece out to that size, lay it in here, make sure it fits, maybe make a couple adjustment cuts if it's not perfect. And I literally just did that over and over again for each room until everything fit. Probably spent an entire afternoon one day just cutting out these roof tiles here. But once that was all done, I added a riser piece here to each one of these buildings just so that there was a border for all of the roof tiles to sit inside of. It made it look a little bit more flush. And then that was a good place for me to put my magnets as well. So everything here is made completely out of foam. And so it was very easy for me. I don't know if you can see it, but I could get a magnet in here, magnets in here, and just lined that up all the way around. They're strong enough magnets where they stay in place, but they're not so strong that they're gonna like move the building or knock other roof tiles out. They're just enough of a grip to make sure that you can't like blow it away. So now that we've talked about how I made the base, how I used cardboard to make the foundation for the walls with some hot glue, let's talk about how I made the interior. So the main entrance of this building, weirdly enough, is the second floor. You can see that with the staircase leading up to the main entryway over here. So I was only responsible for making that. I can only assume maybe the buyer is going to use dungeon tiles or something similar to represent the ground floor, but the top floor is what was on the map. That's what I was tasked with making, so that is what I made. The way to do that, though, is I was like, okay, I know that I need the second floor to be 3 inches high and I don't need to worry about what's underneath it. So 3 inches high, I went ahead and said, okay, well, let's get these stairs out of the way. What I did is I said, I know that I'm using 1 inch thick XPS foam as the floor material for this build because it's thick, it's sturdy, it's not going to chip or crack easily, and if that's 1 inch thick, then I'm going to need some 2-inch pillars or something like that underneath to support it. You know what? That's exactly what I did. I took some scrap XPS foam I had lying around that were in strips, cut them down into 2-inch segments, glued those around the corners and the center of the MDF board and the walls just to make sure there was a really solid platform for this to sit on top of. Once those dried, I cut XPS foam out into the exact shape that I needed to just slide it in there perfectly because I'd already done my measurements. And I had traced my grid tile in there ahead of time, or my grid pattern in there ahead of time, put that in, let it rest. Once everything was done and ready to go, my next step was to do these walls. So to do that, I took some Ready Board or some dollar store foam board. Again, already had my measurements mapped out and ready to go. I sliced everything to the exact cut and size that I needed. I had all my walls mapped out, and then it was just as simple as gluing all of them into place and even cutting out, little door sections here. So you could make these with doors, but the map didn't say specifically whether or not they had doors, and so I said, let's just use some modular doors that we'll send along, and if they want doors on any of these, then they'll have places to put them. The very last step, of course, was the actual bricking, the tiling, the stonework. So I did 2 different methods for that. I said, let's mix it up a little and give some diversity for the piece, making it not as, simple to look at. I made 1 inch by 1/2 inch stone slabs for the inside, which I cut individually or in some cases in strips out of that Ready Board, the same stuff I used here, the dollar store foam board. Textured it with a foam roller just to make it look a little bit more like stone, and then just laid it in there with some glue. Very simple and easy to do, just very tedious. Now the outside, I'm so proud of the way that this turned out. What I used to make these is XPS foam. Now, looking at it, you might think, wow, did he lay individual bricks? But I did not. If you look very closely at the top here, you can actually see that this is one long strip of bricks. And the way I did that, and no sponsorship or anything like that, I use Shifting Lands brick jigs, or stone jigs. I don't remember exactly what they're called, but I have a couple of them, and in fact, I use the same thing to make the stone for the towers, but this one's a little bit of a larger stone cut where these ones are smaller. And it's just as simple as following the instructions for that jig, cutting out a bunch of strips of bricks, and then just laying them one by one in an offset pattern so that they look real. You can texture them, which I did a little bit with a tin foil ball just to give it a little bit more of a stone touch, but truly you don't even need to do that. The jig does a great job. And then we'll get to painting later on, but once you have all of that done, the magic really comes out when you start painting. So now let's talk about these stairs. So before we start talking about the walls, I just wanted to cover this little piece here because it was a really simple, fun thing to do. One of the things I honestly put off to the last minute because I knew how small of a job it was, but I was really happy with how they turned out, and there's just something super satisfying about just sliding that into the build and having it fit perfectly. So what I did to make these, I took 1/2 inch strips of XPS foam, cut to the exact width they needed to be able to fit into the piece over there, and just made each one exactly a 1/2 inch shorter than the previous one. Once I did that, I textured them with a foam roller to give them a little bit of that stone pattern, and then just glued them right on top of each other, making sure that the back end was completely flat. I did need to make a couple little cuts here with an alpha blade to make sure that it slid in on that little curved section you see over there. But once I did, it was ready to go. The method behind this too, I did ask the buyer ahead of time, do you want them to be realistic or functional for gameplay? He said functional for gameplay, which I thought he would. I would do the same thing. And with that being said, I was like, you know, a 1/2 inch isn't really a big enough piece for a miniature to comfortably sit on. So why don't I take out a knife or a clay tool. I honestly don't remember what I used, but I used some kind of a tool to be able to go further back in here. So there's like a little lip for the base of the miniature to sit under, so it's wedged in there when it's going on the stairs. Love the way it works, and yeah, I think those turned out really cool. So let's finally talk about these walls. Like I said, I wanted to start the build from the inside out just because I knew that these walls needed to fit snug around the entire perimeter of the building, so it just made sense for the building to exist before the walls did. So, the method that I used for this is taking pieces of 1-inch XPS foam, gluing them together, with the front side being 6 inches and the back side being 4.5 inches, meaning that the back is exactly 1.5 inches smaller than the front, so that there's like a little ledge or a walkway for miniatures to go on, and so it's the right height for them to look over the palisades there. So, or look through, I guess maybe might be the right term. But the method that I used for these, I'm not even going to get into it, I'm just going to link you the tutorial. I used Zorpazorp's Minas Tirith wall technique to make these walls as far as the stone pattern went. So I'm not going to show you how I did that. I will post a link, and it's a great tutorial if you guys want to make stone walls for yourself. I probably carved each one of these, once they were glued together, of course. Once the walls were glued together, I probably carved out the brick pattern and made the indentations in about 30 minutes or less per wall section, and they look great. So talking about the wall sections, there are 20 of them. They come in either 4-inch, 6-inch, or 8-inch long strips, depending on where I needed them to fit around the perimeter. But I did them that way just so that they would be a little bit more uniform, and if the buyer ever wanted to not use them for the Moathouse, they could take them off and use them for city walls or dungeon walls or something like that. I didn't want them to be static pieces. Then, with them not being static pieces, you might ask yourself, how did you get them to connect? Are they magnetized? Are they weighed down? Well, I weighed a lot of options to do that, and I did start off with magnets, which is why these two here are sticking together. None of the other ones will do that. I started the magnetizing process and thought that was going to be the route that I would go, and then I realized, you know what? If I want these to be usable outside of this build, that means that all of these walls are going to have to be completely uniform, exactly 90 degrees as far as this angle right here, meaning all of the foam that I use has to be cut exactly the same way, and all of the magnets are going to have the same polarization, be in the exact same spots, and I'm sure even just by the sentence that I'm saying right now, you could see how exhausting and how tedious that was going to be. I said, let's not do that. This was a cool experiment, but instead, let's just weigh all of them down. So every single one of these walls has anywhere from, I believe, 4 to 6 different hex nuts made out of zinc in there, so they're pretty heavy. And those are used to just kind of weigh the wall down and give it a little bit of, weight. And that way they're not just so easy to blow over, but you can line them up. And if they're not perfectly flush with each other, they still create a good look, and you don't have to worry about magnets sticking. So before we get into the painting, the very last 2 things we need to talk about are the wood rubble piles and the stone rubble piles, including the rubble in the walls. So we'll start with the wood because that's probably the easiest. All these are craft sticks of varying sizes that I literally just snapped and broke apart and started gluing them in a way that made them look like they were like scatter piles, like this one, or even single pieces of wood, like these, or even the big ones like this, which are supposed to represent fallen rafters of a roof that once existed on this building. So the buyer can use them however they want. I mean, obviously the rafters are going to stay up here, but I wanted the rest of the wood to be, usable anywhere. They could throw it in the building, in the courtyard, in the moat, if they wanted to. Same thing with this, same thing. This is just the Moathouse door while we're talking about wood. These are just more crafting sticks that I cut down. I didn't want them to look perfect and be flush because these are ruins, which honestly, if you're making ruins, that's a great thing about them is you don't have to be as perfect with your cuts and it still looks good. And then everything is just shaded down with a brown wash. I think I used my homemade brown wash for these, if I remember right. But either way, you could use a wood stain or something else. But they look great. Let's talk about these stone ruins now. So I had a couple options for these and decided on a very specific technique. I made the bottom of all of these with MDF board just to make them weighed down. I created bases with blocks of XPS foam, carved them down with an alpha blade into a little bit more of an angle. All I really did is I glued all of these random pieces of foam that I had laying around and left over that I'd collected from previous projects, including cutting out the bottom of these walls, to make this pile of stone. You can see I probably in a couple places went a little bit overboard on the glue. I did hot glue as a base, but also put some PVA glue in there just to really try and create like a glob and a sturdy piece so it was one thing and things wouldn't just fall off. Maybe went a little overboard where you can see some of the smoother parts there, but overall with the paint job it still works. So that's how I made this. It's how I made this little piece of rubble that just slides onto this tower here. And even my favorite one, this wall section back here, same thing, just chunks of XPS foam with a bunch of smaller chunks of XPS foam glued on. All right, and finally, let's talk about the paint job. I won't get into the specifics of the painting. I'll just let you know that I used Tabletop World's stone painting technique for the actual color scheme, but instead of using Citadel paints, I used some cheaper paints just to get the same effect. It's not as detailed of a build as something that they would do, and it's a very large piece, so I didn't want to blow through, $100 worth of paint when I could do it for $8 worth of paint. So the one difference between mine and the Tabletop World painting technique is that they use a sand-colored wash over all of the stone to give it like this bright stone look. I don't want mine to look like bright stone. I wanted it to look old, moldy, and musty. So I skipped that brown or the sandy kind of colored wash and instead just jumped straight into a black wash, a brown wash, and then after the fact, a little bit of a green wash in a couple key areas where moisture and mold might collect. All of those washes are homemade. I used, Black Magic Crafts Better Black Wash recipe, but just did that with a black, with a brown, and with a green. So I'm gonna show you a quick video that I had posted on Instagram earlier, showing you how I did that wash technique very fast for the entire build. The walls and the outside of these buildings and the rubble piles are all painted with the exact same technique. And that was it. That's the Moathouse from the Temple of Elemental Evil from Greyhawk. I want to go ahead and wrap up this review build that I've done to give you the couple things that I learned making this epic build that if you're going to do the same thing, hopefully you can take my advice and not learn what I did the hard way. So lesson number one is that you cannot over plan for a build like this. And that actually is going to lead me into number two, but just know that you can truly not over plan. Have everything mapped out, have multiple checklists, have grid paper drawn, just because the more that you plan, the less you're going to have to figure out as you go, and that's just going to make the whole building process that much faster. Point number two, to kind of bounce off of that, is that if I'm ever going to do a combination of a building and a terrain board like that ever again, this time I built the swamp boards first, and then I built the buildings on top of it, right? I had planned, I had all my measurements, but when I did that, it turned out that the base of the Moathouse, the actual piece of land the Moathouse sat on, I made it way too big. Somehow my scale was off the first time I did it, and that actually caused me to have to go back and remake two of those four boards. So in the future, I would make the building first and then build the board underneath it and use the base of the building as, you know, kind of the jumping point for the terrain board. So building first, then board, not the opposite. Number three, understand that what you're making when you build something like this is a piece of art. This is the polar opposite of building some cheap reusable dungeon tiles, right? This is a not quite, I wouldn't say it's like diorama quality necessarily. It's still a tabletop quality build, but you are making something that is a display piece that's going to take a long time. This is a work of art, and you need to build it understanding that. It's going to take up a lot of space. It's going to be something that hopefully you can put in your game room or, you know, your basement or wherever you're going to put it on display and have people come over and have that wow factor. This is a wow piece, similar to a sculpture or something that you would hang on your wall. You need to treat this as a piece of art. And then finally, very simple piece of advice is just, however long you think something like this is going to take, double that time, and hopefully that's how long it is. I thought that I would easily be able to knock this whole thing out in a month because I knew all the techniques, I knew all the processes, the materials. I'm like, I've done buildings before. Like, this is just taking that and making it that much bigger. Well, it took me twice as long as I thought it was going to. And I find with a lot of the new builds that I do, things do tend to take almost twice as long as I think they're going to. So just experienced crafter trying to tell you guys, if you haven't been crafting a long time, however long you think something's going to take, go ahead and double that time. So thanks a lot. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I will be back very soon with a regular tutorial for another cool terrain board that I built. I'll see you guys soon. Bye.